Buckle up because we're about to make the quickest quilt this side of YouTube. You're not going to believe how quick and easy this quilt is to make. It's a little bit unconventional. Let me show you how. This quilt is a little bit special because it's for my annual quilt donation drive for Comfort Cases, a nationwide charity here in the USA that serves all 50 states, making up cases to make for children entering the foster care system. And if you'd like to know more about that, I'll put the links down below. But in the meantime, press your fabric, including that manufacturer's fold, and then let's get going and making the quickest quilt you've ever seen. You'll need 4 5/8 of a yard quilting cotton fabric plus 3 yards for the backing. The finished size is approximately 50 inches by 52 inches, and I've made a reference sheet for this quilt. You can find a copy of this over on my website. I'll put a link down below. So we've got 4 pieces of fabric that are 5/8 of a yard, which is around 22 inches and a half. Now what we're going to do is cut them into 13-inch strips from the width that we had them cut. So I'm just going to get my first cut here. I'm going to do a little bit extra because if you're a Ruby Star Society lover, you'll know we keep these salvages and make things with them. So just moving that down, lining up that edge on my 0. And then finding 13 on my mat and cutting. I like to check down the bottom, up the top, and then down the bottom again, and then up at the top again, because things do shift around. And then when you're happy, let's cut. And I'll repeat that until I've got 3 pieces that are 13 inches wide. The beautiful fabric that I'm using is called Picture Book by Kimberly Kite and was kindly donated by Ruby Star Society for the quilt donation drive. Okay, then when I've finished cutting my 3 pieces from my first fabric, I'll take my next fabric and do exactly the same. So we're cutting 3 pieces at 13 inches wide for all 4 pieces of fabric. So now I've just got my fabrics how I'd like to sew them together. They're kind of in a bit of a color gradient, which I think will look super cute. Now what we're going to do is we're going to sew together the 4 fabrics, so then we'll end up with 3 sets of 4 fabrics sewn together. And what we want to do is make sure we sew them all together exactly in the same way. So I'm going to sew mine from left to right. Sometimes if you change the way you sew them, they accidentally end up on the wrong side. And I know that because I've made that mistake before. So all I'll do now is sew 3 sets of my 4 fabrics together in exactly the same order. So I've got my first 2 pieces that I'm going to sew together. Now if you just cut your fabric from how it came from the fabric shop, the pieces might not have been exactly the same length. So just make sure that you're lining the edges up at the very top here, and then we won't worry about the bottom because we're going to trim that off. So I'm lining up all my edges on the top and the side here. And if you'd like to, you can just pop a few pins in. Pins are optional, and if you're a beginner, I do really highly recommend you use them. It just stops your fabric moving around without you knowing. Okay, so now we're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm using Wonderful Thread, who are sponsors of our quilt donation drive. I'm stitching at stitch length 2. I'm starting at the very edge and just going to sew along. Coming off the very edge, cutting my thread, and then I'm just going to open it up, take my next piece and sew it on, and so on, remembering to make sure they're in the correct order. So now I'm just going to set the stitches, and that sets the stitches into our fabric, making the stitches stronger and helping our quilt top lay flatter. Then I'm going to press the seams down. Remember, the elephant was my first fabric, all going down. It doesn't actually really matter. It just helps when we're sewing it that they're all in the same direction. but we're not nesting any seams in this quilt, which is one of the reasons that makes it super quick to make. And I'll repeat that. Now what we're going to do is sew the first piece and the last piece together, and then if your pieces were slightly different lengths like mine were, make sure that you're starting up on the edge where all your edges were nicely lined up. So just taking that nicely lined up edge, and I'll pop some pins in and I'll sew along here. Sorry, I don't know if that was clear enough. We're sewing the right sides together along this edge, which is ultimately turning our fabric into one big loop. So just like before, starting on the very edge, 1/4 inch seam allowance, stitch length 2, cutting my thread at the end, and now I'm going to repeat that for my remaining 2 sets. So then I'll have 3 sets of 4 fabrics sewn together in a tube. So I've got my fabric here sewn in a tube, and I just did give that top seam a press. I didn't press it in any particular direction, I just set the stitches. Now what we're going to do is for each of our 3 sets, cut it into 7-inch strips. And what I've done is I've taken the edge of my fabric there and I'm going to line it up on a line on my ruler. And then I'm going to take this bottom piece, fold it over carefully. We don't want it all sort of twisted or folded underneath there. We want it folded up nicely. And then we're going to line it up with a line on our mat. So I'm just going to do that. I just gently push it down to see if it is lined up. So once it's lined up at the bottom, that's looking pretty good. I will just check that it's still lined up at the top. It can slightly move as you're doing this. So just check you're happy with it. And once you're happy, we'll just cut that first rough edge off. So we've got a nice straight edge to start with. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up the line on my ruler on the fold and a line on my ruler on the top edge there. And then we know it's nice and straight. It's also a good way to check that we have folded it nicely and it's going to be nice and straight. You could also check the fold here, the edge of the fabric here on a line on your ruler. Everything should be lining up. Just trimming off that. And then what we're going to do is cut 7-inch strips. So I don't want to move it, so I'm just going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then again lining up the line on my ruler, top and bottom. And if I want to, I can also check here that it's looking pretty good. Okay, so then cutting 7-inch strip, if you want, you can check again, and I will. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And cut. And then I'll cut another 7-inch piece. And the last one. Okay, and now I've got 3 pieces. I'll repeat that for the other 2 sets that we've got. So I've finished cutting my strips and I have 9 in total. We actually only need 8. So with the spare one, you could always just sew it on. We're just trying to stick to the requirements of the Comfort Cases quilts, which are recommended around 30 inches by 40 inches for a baby quilt and 50 by 50 inches for a big kids quilt. So we're just trying to stay within that. If you're making this for just yourself or to give to a friend or what have you, you could either add on the extra row that we've got spare, but I plan on cutting mine in half and then turning it into a nice big bow on my quilt that I'm donating. So I'll pop that one aside. So now comes the fun part, but the slightly unconventional part. What we're going to do is we're going to take our first strip and we're going to decide which fabric we'd like to start on the top left hand corner. And for me, it's this elephant fabric here, so I want that one to be first. So what I need to do is unpick these stitches with my seam ripper. So I'll just carefully do that. Okay, so I've unpicked that, and now if we open it up, I just will remove any little loose threads now. It's easier to do it as we've unpicked those stitches rather than at the end. So open that up, it's a bit long for the view. Then I'm going to take my next piece, line it up so I've got the elephant. Well, that's my first fabric, so it'll be your first fabric, but you can see it's my elephant fabric. Now what we're doing is we're staggering them across. So now what we want to have is we want to have just half of an elephant with our next fabric starting here. And the reason why I'm doing this is because it's going to look really cute, but also because we don't need to be nesting all these seams, which is going to make it way quicker to sew together. So now what I need to do is take my elephant fabric, have it facing me. Now what we need to do is find the center of this fabric, because we're going to draw a line down it and then cut it carefully. So I'm going to take a ruler, and remembering our piece measured 13 inches, I'm just going to place my ruler on top, line up the edge on this edge of the fabric, find 13 on my ruler and line it up on that edge. And then what I'm going to do, again, you could also find a line on this side so you know it's really nice and straight. Find 6.5, because 6.5 is half of 13, and just do a little dot. And I'll do that in a few places, and then I'll basically do a connect the dots. I'll draw a line along those dots. So 6.5. So there I've got. So I'll take my ruler, I'll line up a line on my edge of my fabric. I'll find my 3 dots and draw a line connecting them all. Now what we're going to do is take fabric scissors and just really carefully cut along that drawn line. Being careful to just cut through the one layer. Don't forget we have that second layer underneath. So now if we take a look, we've got half of our first fabric, and for me that's my elephant fabric. And then if I put this one down here, you can see the pattern is starting to happen. Now what I'm going to do is sew these two pieces together, but there is a little trick to this. Because this piece was unpicked, we have our seam allowance here, which is 1/4 inch on this end and 1/4 inch on the other end. However, this piece we cut in half. So that means this piece is 1/2 inch longer than this piece. So what we're going to do is make sure we line up this cut edge along where the stitches were, or 1/4 inch down from the edge. So I'm just going to place that right sides together. Start 1/4 inch down, or right on where I can see those stitches were. Pin and sew. Now pinning is a personal preference. If you're confident, then a lot of people don't pin, but I do highly recommend them if you're a beginner. And you can see I've come to the other end, and my fabric is that 1/4 inch shorter like I said it would be, so that's perfect. Let's sew along this edge. So I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm stitching at stitch length 2. I'm using wonderful confetti thread, which was kindly donated, and I'm starting at the very edge and going to sew all the way along to the very end. I'm not worrying about a back stitch. And I did have to turn my pins around because I'd put them in upside down. And then when I come to the seams, I'm just going to sew them in the direction they were pressed. It doesn't matter too much because we aren't nesting seams, but it will help our quilt top sit nicely. Coming off the very edge, cutting my thread. Now let me show you how to add on the next few rows. You can see the pattern starting to take shape. Now we need to sew on our next row, which is going to be this piece here. So we started with the first fabric, now we're going to move on to our second fabric. So our second fabric was the flowers. So I'm just going to find my flowers and then I will unpick that just like we did the first row. So now I'll just move that up and you can see that Now we're creating our pattern. I've got the cute fabric flower coming from here to here to here, and then now we need to cut the flower fabric in half, just like we did for the elephant fabric. So I like to do them 2 at a time. We're going to sew one full and one half, and then we move on to the next. So now I will just prepare the next row. I'll find my flower fabric. I'm going to measure 13 inches. Oh, and it's been pressed the wrong way. So I'll just make sure all my lines are lined up nicely. Find 6.5 on my ruler, mark that in a few spots, and then draw my line. If you're enjoying this video, please hit the subscribe button. I really appreciate it. It means the world to me. Cutting, being careful just to cut through that one layer. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew that row on. Remembering I have the 1/4 inch extra here, so I will make sure that the row that's cut is lined up where the stitches were, or 1/4 inch past the cut row. Then I'll sew on my cut row again. Again, this time it's below the stitches or 1/4 inch down, and that means we're going to end up with it nice and straight and we're not getting mucked up with that extra 1/2 inch on the non-cut pieces. So then when I've sewn those together, I'll just carry on, and my next fabric is my purple fabric here, so I will do exactly the same. I'll unpick it so I can start with the full purple here, and then I'll cut the purple in half, and on and on and on until I've sewn all my 8 rows, or 9 if you wanted to use that last extra row. So starting at the very beginning again, and it's slightly staggered. I just want to clarify that it is slightly staggered, making up for that 1/2 inch on the non-cut pieces, and sewing along that whole edge. Ta-da! Isn't that the quickest quilt you've seen this side of YouTube in a long time? I'm absolutely thrilled with how it turned out. Now what you need to do is press those seams all in one direction, square it off, remembering we've got some edges here that are slightly different sizes. It's a 1/4 inch bigger and then smaller, blah, blah, blah. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Trim any loose threads, and then let me just clarify one little issue I did have. So just one thing to note is make sure you're unpicking the stitches on the right side of your piece. For example, if you unpick them on this side, the elephant fabric would be my last fabric in the row, and if I unpick them on the right hand side, it's going to be the first fabric in my row. I did make that mistake, and I sewed it on before I checked I was getting my pattern, and I ended up in a right royal pickle. So don't do that. Make sure you're unpicking it from the correct side, and do check you do have the pattern happening before you sew on each row. So finish off your quilt top however you'd like. If you'd like to see my easy self-binding technique, I'll put a link up above. And if you'd like to join me in donating a quilt to Comfort Cases for my annual quilt donation drive, I'd be thrilled to bits. I'll put a link down below with all the details. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next video.